Hello and welcome to this update on results from the nasal swab study that's being conducted as part of COVIDENCE UK among participants who have asthma. My name's Adrian Martineau. I'm Professor of Respiratory Infection here at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm Chief Investigator on the study. So, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, asthma imposes a huge burden both in the UK and internationally. Here in Britain, around 5.4 million people receive asthma treatment on a regular basis, and asthma is the cause of around 60,000 hospital admissions and more than 1,000 deaths each year here in the UK. And respiratory infections are particularly important in people with asthma because they're the commonest trigger or precipitant of asthma attacks or exacerbations. Now, before going on to share some of the early results of our study that you've been contributing to for the last year, I just wanted to give a bit of background. And really, before the pandemic, rhinovirus, which is the commonest viral cause of the common cold, was also the major trigger of asthma attacks in the UK, both in children and adults. During lockdown, what we saw was actually a reduced risk of asthma exacerbation that was probably associated with reduced transmission of viral respiratory infections in general. But there was some emerging evidence from COVIDENCE UK and from other studies that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19, could also be a precipitant or trigger of asthma attacks. As lockdown was relaxed, asthma exacerbations rebounded, and we showed that in COVIDENCE UK, and others showed that in other settings around the world. And other viruses became resurgent, particularly a virus called RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus. In addition, seasonal changes in virus patterns, which had been well established before the pandemic, were upset a bit, and there were shifts in the seasonality of various different viruses, including flu. But now that we're well post the pandemic phase, there really is a lack of information about which viruses are circulating in people with asthma, and in particular, whether SARS-CoV-2 is now an important trigger of asthma attacks as compared with before the pandemic. We were also interested to build on findings from COVIDENCE UK that suggested that people who'd had respiratory viruses other than coronavirus also had extended symptoms. And you may remember this work from Giulia Vivaldi, who was a PhD student at that time, now an epidemiologist over at King's College London. But she worked on this analysis from COVIDENCE UK data, which shows long-term symptoms in COVIDENCE UK participants who had no infection in the recent past. So these are illustrated in blue here, those who had SARS-CoV-2 illustrated in red, and those who had an acute respiratory infection that was negative for SARS-CoV-2. So we think that's probably likely due to rhinovirus, seasonal coronaviruses, influenza virus, and a mix of other pathogens. And what you can see here is that there's a clear distinction between those who've had no infection and those who've had any infection, with the patterns for SARS-CoV-2 and non-COVID-19 acute respiratory infection tracking quite similarly together, except for symptoms around smell and taste, where you can see, as has well been described by ourselves and by others, SARS-CoV-2 is particularly likely to cause long-term symptoms with anosmia, or problems with smelling and tasting, compared to other respiratory infections. So, building really on this background, we wanted to answer a few questions. First of all, we wanted to know what's the relative frequency of different viral respiratory infections among UK adults who have asthma in 2025 to 6, so a long time post-pandemic. Secondly, we wanted to know whether the risk of an asthma attack differed between different viruses. We wanted to know whether the severity of asthma symptoms differed between different viruses, and whether long-term symptom profiles differed between viruses. So essentially, we built a sub-study onto the COVIDENCE UK study, where we invited everybody who'd signed up to COVIDENCE UK, but who also had asthma, to take part in this study, and we posted you a nasal swab pack. Then we asked you to complete an asthma control test and also this very lengthy questionnaire, and I'm really grateful to everybody for sticking with this one and having the patience to complete it. The symptom burden questionnaire, or SBQ, which captures long-term symptoms of respiratory infection. It was designed specifically for long COVID, but actually it's pretty useful for capturing long-term symptoms of any respiratory infection, which is why we used it. Then, when you had symptoms of a cold or respiratory infection, we asked you to take a nasal swab, put it in the post to us, and then repeat these questionnaires at that time, at the moment of symptom onset, and again 4 and 12 weeks later to capture the long-term effects that were associated with the viral infection. When we got your swab here in the lab at the Blizzard Institute in Whitechapel, this is a Queen Mary campus for the medical school, we took that swab and we eluted it, so we dipped it in viral transport medium effectively to get the viruses off the swab and into cold storage where they're stable for several months. And then just recently we've started to batch process these eluates or swab samples to measure 15 different respiratory viruses in them, and then compare how often we can detect these different viruses, whether or not some viruses are more likely to be associated with asthma attacks than others, and whether or not some viruses are associated with longer duration or longer severity of symptoms at 4 and 12 weeks post onset. Now, this analysis is still ongoing, but I am able to just share preliminary results from the first 100 or so swabs that we've got in. To date, we've got around 500 swabs, so the lab's just working through them. But given all your efforts and the fact that the initial phase of this study is now completing, I wanted to share the interim results that are available to us. So we invited a total of 2,060 participants in COVIDENCE UK who also had asthma to take part. And of those, 833 of you agreed to take part, and I'm very grateful for that. 112 withdrew or didn't contribute baseline data, leaving 721 who contributed baseline data and received our swab pack through the post. And here are the characteristics of the 721 people who took part in this study. In terms of the age groups, you can see the best represented are those between 50 and 80 years old. Around 3/4 were women and around 1/4 were men. The vast majority were of white ethnic origin, but a small minority, 4%, from other ethnic groups. And predominantly people had not had a severe asthma attack, which we define as one requiring systemic corticosteroids in the last year. So that was 78% or so. So the remaining 22% had had one or more severe asthma attacks in the previous year. And you can see, and this is one of the real strengths of the study, that there's representation from all over the UK. So the big advantage of this is that it means that our findings are generalizable not just to one small part of the UK, but to people with asthma all over the country. So here is a quick summary of where the first batch of samples leaves us. You can see that the most commonly detected virus is the rhinovirus here. That's fifth along from the left. The second most commonly detected virus is the coronavirus associated with COVID-19. And the third most commonly detected group are enteroviruses other than rhinovirus, most likely enterovirus B, but we don't subtype those. And you can see there's a scattering of other viruses there. And when we then looked at the proportion of virus positive episodes that were associated with asthma exacerbation, we could see that SARS-CoV-2 appeared to be the most important trigger of a single pathogen trigger, with 47% of people who had a SARS-CoV-2 infection going on to develop an asthma attack, compared with 40% who had a non-rhinovirus enterovirus and just 24% of those who had a rhinovirus. We were then able to look at asthma control test scores at baseline. That's at symptom onset, shown in green, at week 4, shown in blue, and at week 12 after symptom onset, shown in red. And what you can see here is that particularly for the SARS-CoV-2, we see a symptom or asthma control dip at the 4-week time point. And that dip appears to be more profound for people who've had recent SARS-CoV-2 infection than it does, for example, for people who've had rhinovirus infection. We haven't run statistical analyses on this as yet because a lot of the samples have still to be analysed. I also wanted to illustrate the way that the very detailed information that you've given us can be used to pick up very precise symptom profiles for the different pathogens. So here we've got different dimensions. There are 5 dimensions on the asthma control test: inhaler use, productivity, self-perception, sleep disruption, breathlessness. And you can see that different pathogens tend to cause slightly different patterns of symptoms. So here at week 4, for example, if you have a rhinovirus, you don't tend to get much in the way of sleep disruption. But if you have SARS-CoV-2 or another enterovirus, that tends to cause more sleep disruption. And then at week 12, you can see that if you've got another enterovirus, that sleep disruption tends to recover, but that symptom tends to be more persistent if you've had SARS-CoV-2 infection. So again, we haven't subjected this to formal statistical analysis, but I just wanted to give you a feel for the granularity and detail of the information that you've given us, how we can use that to distinguish quite distinct symptom profiles for the different pathogens. We can do this in even more detail using the data from that very long questionnaire you completed, the SBQ, and here you can see symptom scores at onset, week 4 and week 12 for the multiple dimensions of symptoms that are covered with that SBQ questionnaire. Just overall, you can see that the area enclosed within the symptom circle for each of these pathogens is large at onset and gets smaller with over time. And you can start to see that we're seeing distinct patterns for the different pathogens. Again, not subjected to formal statistical analysis, but I just wanted to use this to illustrate to you the detail with which we're going to be able to distinguish symptom patterns for different viral pathogens we're detecting in the swabs that you've sent us. So that's where we're up to at the moment. In terms of the research questions that we set out to answer, first of all, the relative frequency of different viral respiratory infections in UK adults with asthma in 25-26. Well, so far, we've got rhinovirus being the most common, with SARS-CoV-2 being the second most common, and then others coming in third and downstream places. But I hasten to add, this was from early samples, so this pattern may change as we get to analyse the samples that you've sent us over the winter and spring. Secondly, does risk of asthma exacerbation differ between viruses? Well, initial indications are that SARS-CoV-2 infection episodes are associated with a slightly higher risk of asthma exacerbation than rhinovirus. But again, these are preliminary results, so I'll be bringing you the full results once all data are in. A similar pattern really we're seeing with severity of asthma symptoms. They tend to be a bit more severe following SARS-CoV-2 compared with other pathogens, especially at the 4-week time point. And in terms of the symptom profile, there does appear to be an indication from these preliminary data that SARS-CoV-2 could be associated with worse nocturnal symptoms. So where next? Well, we're busy analysing all of the rest of the samples that you sent us. We'll process those in the next couple of months. Then comes the formal statistical analysis, and as soon as that's ready, we'll write up the paper, put it onto a preprint, and then I'll do another webinar to give you the final results, which will include a link to that preprint, which will then submit to a journal for peer review and ultimately publication. But really, I just wanted to do this talk, first of all, to show you how we're going to use your data, but secondly, to say a massive thank you, partly to the team who've been doing this study, and David Joliffe in particular has been absolutely key in delivering the study and organising everything to the very highest standards, as always. So thank you, David. To Paul Pfeffer, who's our Professor of Respiratory Infection here at Queen Mary, alongside myself, Sachi and Allah, who are the people in the lab who've been processing your samples, and then the virology team at Barts Health and the East and South East London Pathology Partnership, who've been processing the samples. Very grateful to Barts Charity for funding the study, But of course, the biggest thank you goes to all of you who've not just completed this last study, which involved, I appreciate, some very lengthy questionnaires, but also who've been with COVIDENCE UK right since the 1st of May 2020. So that's coming up to a whole 6 years during which you faithfully completed multiple questionnaires for us. So I'm really grateful to you, as are all the team, for everything that you've done to support our research. So thank you once again. For those of you who've submitted swabs within the last 12 weeks, you'll continue to receive follow-up questionnaires, but as of the end of the month, the 1 year period of recruitment is now complete. So if you do get another respiratory infection, we won't be able to process that swab. There'll just be some follow-up questionnaires for those who've sent us swabs in the last 12 weeks. However, you will hear from me and the team again in around about 4 to 6 months' time, once all of the analyses are complete, and at that point I'll be able to give you the final results of the study. So that's all for now, and I look forward to seeing you again on the webinar, which will present the definitive results in a few months' time. From everybody here at COVIDENCE UK, thank you and bye for now.